For decades, Canada was the quiet neighbor, reliable, peaceful, and rarely seen as a military power. It spent less than 2% of its GDP on defense, frustrating Washington, which saw Canada as benefiting from US protection without paying its share. The idea that Canada could challenge American dominance was unthinkable, but that changed. Canada transformed its perceived weakness, a non-militarized economy, into a strategic advantage. Under mounting pressure, Ottawa made a bold move. It decided to leverage its vast reserves of critical minerals. These minerals are essential for everything from smartphones to advanced missile systems. While the US counted tanks and ships, Canada mapped its lithium, cobalt, and rare earth deposits. Suddenly, Canada realized it held the keys to America's most advanced industries, especially defense. The quiet neighbor had found its voice: economic leverage. The world is now watching as Canada steps onto the global stage, not just as a supplier, but as a power dictating terms. This shift challenges the North American alliance and redefines what power means in the 21st century. The era of the quiet Canadian is over. A new assertive era has begun. The crisis began with a phone call, a routine US request for specialized alloys from Canada. For years, these contracts were automatic. This time, Canada said no. The Canadian government had suspended all exports of critical minerals to US defense contractors. Washington was stunned. Disbelief turned to panic as the reality set in. The supply chain was cut. This was Canada's response to years of US pressure and threats over defense spending. Instead of complying, Canada retaliated. The Prime Minister announced the Minerals for Sovereignty policy. Canadian resources would be reserved for domestic use and respectful partners. The message was clear. Canada would act as a strategic power, but on its own terms. The White House was left reeling. Decades of US policy had assumed Canadian compliance. Now, the tables had turned. The US found itself dependent, and Canada held the cards. The script had been flipped, and Washington was scrambling to adapt. The world watched as a new power dynamic emerged. Canada's refusal was more than a trade dispute. It was a declaration of independence. The US faced a crisis it never saw coming. The quiet neighbor had just made the loudest statement in decades. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within weeks, America's industrial heartland began to fracture. The Abrams tank plant in Ohio halted production. No cobalt tungsten alloy from Canada. Raytheon's missile guidance systems in Arizona went dark, lacking Canadian graphite and rare earths. The domino effect hit small suppliers and logistics firms across the country. The crisis spread beyond defense. Detroit's automakers slashed EV battery production, losing access to Canadian lithium and nickel. Market chaos followed. Mineral prices soared, stocks plummeted, and the Dow suffered its worst drop of the year. The crisis exposed a core weakness: America's reliance on fragile global supply chains. The US had built a house of cards, and Canada had just pulled out the foundation. Communities that hoped for a manufacturing revival faced new uncertainty. The shockwaves were felt far beyond the factory floor. America's economic vulnerability was laid bare. As American industries faltered, Canada's global stature soared. The Minerals for Sovereignty policy was a masterstroke, turning Canada into a mineral superpower. Ottawa was flooded with calls from nations eager to secure resources. European delegations arrived, offering partnerships and investments in exchange for minerals the US could no longer access. For Europe, this was a chance to reduce dependence on both the US and China. Japan, South Korea, and India quickly followed, seeking stable, democratic supply chains. The world was realigning, with Canada at the center. Canada could now demand investment in domestic processing, set environmental standards, and move up the value chain. The Canadian dollar surged, symbolizing this new power. Canada was no longer just a supplier, it was setting the rules. The lesson was clear. In the modern world, control of resources is as powerful as control of armies. The global economic landscape had shifted. Canada was now a force to be reckoned with. The geopolitical chessboard was reset overnight. In Beijing, China saw vindication for its own resource strategy, and quietly offered its mineral reserves to nations seeking stability. Europe publicly called for dialogue, but privately saw opportunity. Canada's move showed middle powers could stand up to superpowers. European giants like Airbus and Volkswagen accelerated plans to build non-US supply chains. Saudi Arabia, eyeing its own resource leverage, accelerated mining investments inspired by Canada's example. The message was clear: resource nationalism was now a powerful tool, and the US was uniquely vulnerable. A new global marketplace for alliances and resources was forming, with the US on the outside looking in. Nations stopped asking, "What will Washington think?" and started asking, "Where can we get our lithium?" The crisis revealed that global power was as much about logistics as ideology. With supply chains broken, the post-Cold War order was in question. The world was moving on, with or without American leadership. The US faced a new reality, one where it was no longer the center of gravity. Inside the Pentagon, the mood was grim. The mineral suspension was a national security crisis. The US military's dependence on Canadian minerals was systemic, woven into jets, submarines, and advanced weaponry. The F-35 program and Virginia-class submarines faced immediate disruption. The Pentagon scrambled to inventory stockpiles and cannibalize old equipment, degrading readiness. Planners modeled worst-case scenarios. What if the US couldn't replace missiles or aircraft in a conflict? The answers were sobering. The crisis forced a reckoning. Decades of outsourcing and just-in-time logistics had created a strategic blunder. America's military might was suddenly at the mercy of a supply chain it didn't control. The Achilles heel wasn't a new enemy weapon, it was a missing procurement order. The missile crisis sparked a moment of national reflection. America's relentless pursuit of efficiency had left it startlingly vulnerable. Outsourcing enriched corporations but hollowed out the industrial base and eroded self-sufficiency. The empty factories of the Rust Belt became monuments to strategic failure. The nation that once led the world in innovation now couldn't produce its own defense materials. A rare consensus emerged: something had to change. The debate shifted from whether to bring manufacturing back to how fast it could be done. Canada's actions shattered the illusion that the free market would always provide. The US now faced the hard work of rebuilding, rethinking its economy, investing in strategic sectors, and accepting higher costs for security. Dependence was no longer an option. As the dust settles, the US stands at a crossroads. The immediate priority: de-escalate the crisis and restore mineral flows from Canada. For the first time in decades, the US must negotiate from a position of weakness, offering real concessions and respect. A new partnership with Canada is essential. In the medium term, the US must launch a strategic resource initiative, fast-tracking domestic mines, refineries, and processing plants. It will be a monumental, costly, and controversial effort, but necessary for national security. The crisis signals the end of the unipolar moment. Power is now more diffuse, and economic leverage rivals military force. The Pentagon must rethink procurement, building resilience into supply chains, even at higher costs. For now, the balance of power has shifted. Canada holds a powerful hand, and the US must adapt. Whether America can regain its edge remains to be seen. It will require unity, vision, and industrial mobilization not seen since World War II. The American missile crisis of 2025 will be remembered as a wake-up call. In the 21st century, no nation can afford to take its friends or its supply chains for granted.